When it comes to leading around using a marker float or using a spod, I only use one rod, and I'm going to run you through everything you need to know from start to finish on how to set this up. How to load a reel with braid, how to add a braided leader. But first, let's have a look at how you can loop on your lead, your marker float or your spod. So I've loaded 300 meters of spod marker braid onto the marker reel, and then I've added 8 meters of 30-pound leader. If you want to make one rod do the job of a marker rod, a leading rod and a spod rod, this is what you need to do. The secret of how I do this is to be found at the end of the leader. And all I have is 2 loops, one small loop, one big loop. And these are not fancy loops, not complicated loops, they're just 2 single overhand knots. The small loop gives me a quick pull release, so I can quickly change from a leading rod to a marker rod to the spod rod. The big loop is large enough for me to pass through a marker rod or a spod or a spom or whatever I need to use. To tie this, what you want to do is to tie the big loop first. So the big loop goes from that point to that point. That's about 20 centimeters long. And then I just tie one small loop. So that's the small loop, that's the big loop. That's how it's going to work. I'm using the same leader from my setup last year, so I don't have to retie those 2 knots again. So to set this up as a leading rod, all I do is I take the small loop, pass it through a lead, and then find the big loop, that's the one above, and pass the lead through the big loop. Draw that back down, and the small loop stays like that. That's a very simple loop-to-loop connection for a feature finding lead. Quick to change, on and off, simple as that. To set this up for a marker float, I'm going to need a few extra bits. I've just got a run ring here with a built-in clip. I thread the small loop through there. Then I need a buffer bead. Pop that buffer bead onto a needle into the small loop. Thread the buffer bead on. Then I take a shock bead. The shock bead has a shallow dish in it, and it's that dish that's going to mate with that bore bead. I push that on like that, and I slide those up over the top knot in the large loop. Then I take my marker float, pass the small loop through there, open up the big loop, and then pass the big loop over the marker float. Pull the loop down until it closes onto the small loop. Then we take our shock bead and run ring assembly, slide it all down. We pass the shock bead over the swivel like that, and then the bore bead sits in the dish like that. The buffer bead then slides down onto the bore bead, and this is what we're going to attach the lead to. Just take any lead that you need. This is just a 3-ounce pair. Hook that on, close the clip in place, and that's my marker float setup. The reason why I use a large plastic ring for this job is that I need the ring to fly over this upper knot. If you just use a regular swivel, then the chances are that it's going to hang up on that knot. So you just need a large plastic ring to fly up and over that knot. So it's that time of year when I need to re-spool my marker reel. Now I want to put 300 meters of 0.18 braid on my marker reel, and to do that I'm going to need some backing line to go underneath it. So this means that I need to load 2 different lines of 2 different diameters onto the same spool. Now one option to do this is I could take a guess. Now there are a couple of problems with doing it this way. If I put on too much backing line, it means when I come to wind on the 300 meters, there's a risk that if I try and use all the 300 meters, that I'll overfill the spool with braid. And if you overfill with braid, you're going to get frap ups through wind knots on the cast. If I don't put enough backing line on, it means I'll wind on my 300 meters of braid, and then the braid will be too far down from the lip. This is going to cost me distance when I'm fishing at maximum range. Now there's a really simple solution to this problem if you've got a spare spool. As it happens, I don't have a spare spool to do this job, so I've got to do this accurately with only one spool. The question is there a way of actually working out the maths? Well, it turns out there is, but I'm going to need the help of an online calculator to do so. So in order to load exactly 300 meters of braid onto this spool, we're going to need to put on 164 metres of backing line. So to re-spool this reel, I'm going to need the butt end of a rod, I'm going to need some sellotape, I'm going to need a screwdriver or a pencil or something to spin the braided spool on, and then I'm going to use a bucket of water to have the spool, the mono, the backing line free spinning in that. So I could tie this on with an arbor knot, but it's just easier to use a bit of tape. I find it's not going to come under any force. I'm going to chuck that spool in the bucket. When I'm winding on with my rod hand, I just hold the line just gently there as I wind it through. That'll make sure it's evenly wound onto the spool. So all I need to do now is count 175 handle turns, not turns of the bail arm, turns of the handle. 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75. There we go. Now just temporarily, I'm going to nick that under the line clip there. Then we need to make the connection to the braid. So to join these, I'm just going to use the back-to-back uni knot. 5 turn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's never going to come under any load here, but I just want a kind of small, neat knot. And then we'll go the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just draw those slowly together. So I'm going to cut those tag ends really short because I don't want any lump in the knot. If this was actually going to come under some load, I'd have used a pair of leather gloves and pulled really hard before I cut those tags, but just as a backing line knot, that's small enough, neat enough and strong enough with really short tags, so that's good to go. Now we can take that out of the clip. This is a thin spool and it's not going to stand up safely in a bucket, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to push it onto a screwdriver just like that, and then I'll spool straight from a free spinning spool. Again, in order to load this evenly, I'm going to apply tension to the braid, but you must wind fairly slowly, because if you wind too quick you will slice your fingers open. This is very thin, sharp braid. Now I've already done my counting. I don't need to count the turns for winding on the braid because I'm going to use the 300 meters that remains on the spool. If I was doing this from a bulk spool, then yes, I would need to do the maths and work out how many turns of braid to put on 300 meters. But in this case, I don't have to do that, so I'm done with counting for today. You can see the size of this backing line knot relative to the braid is quite big. You want to make sure that that backing knot is towards the bottom of the spool. You don't want it up there, otherwise when it's fully filled it's going to give you a kind of lump on the spool, which you don't want. So down there is fine, that's going to get covered up by the braid. This is why we need to put way more braid on than we actually need to use in a fishing situation. We're coming to the end of the spool and I can see from the amount that's already on the reel that this is going to work out just perfect. I do not want this spool overfilled because then I'm going to have wind knot problems. So I'm very happy how that worked out. If I was doing mono on top of braid and looking for maximum casting distance, that would have been a bit pessimistic, a bit conservative, but for braid I do not want that braid to be too close to the lip, so mil and a half down, something like that, is just perfect. That should perform perfectly in use. Now the other thing I've got to add to this before I can actually use it in a fishing situation is I must add a braided leader. The 0.18 braid is far too thin to take the repeated casting loads, so I'm going to add a 30-pound braided leader. Just because it says it's a 30-pound leader on top of a 25-pound braid, you might think, well, £5 difference, that's nothing. The big difference is the diameter. The braided main line is 0.18, that's really thin. The 30-pound leader is much thicker. They don't even actually state what thickness it is, but I can tell you it's a lot thicker. So that's what we need to add on. And I'm going to add on about 10 meters of that. That's a side-by-side of the braided main line versus the braided leader, and there's a big difference in the diameter of those two. So that's the main line, that's the leader. To join these together, we're just going to do the same back-to-back uni knot. To properly tighten this leader knot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a couple of bank sticks and I'm just going to clean them off there, make sure there's no grit or muck or anything that's going to damage the line. And and I'm going to use these to apply extra tension to the knot. So to do this, you take the knot there and then just give yourself some room to maneuver. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 should be enough. Then I take the other stick and again give myself 20 centimeters to play with. 1, 4, 5. So I've got my wraps, I've got my knot in between them, got the 2 sticks, wet it, and then a nice steady pull to really cinch those down. Little pulses. If you've done a good job, the knot should go tapered like this as a double taper, and if it looks like this, then you're safe to cut the tag ends off. That's a nice neat small leader knot, and that's going to fly through the rings. Right, let's wind on the leader. There goes the leader knot. Bonk. There we go, job done. If you're new to spod and marker work, you might be tempted to buy one spool of spod and marker braid and try and split that between a marker rod and a spod rod, 150 meters per setup. Now, if you're only doing that at short range, then yeah, you're going to get away with that. But if you go to any distance whatsoever, even 60-70 meters, you're going to run into problems. And the problem you're going to run into is the size of the backing knot, because that knot is going to click on the line as you cast it, because there's not enough braid on there to properly cover it. You could see when I'm filling that spool with 300 meters of braid that it probably took about 100 meters of braid to fully cover that backing line knot. And the problem is every single one of those clicks is costing you distance, and if you push your luck too far, that braid is going to snag on that knot, the lead's going to come to an abrupt halt, something's going to break, and probably the lead is going to go sailing off into the distance. You're going to have a crack off, and no one wants that. So I've made the mistake myself. I've tried to make 300 meters of braid do a marker rod and a spod rod, and it did not work out well. In the end, I had to bin both because neither of them worked very well, and go out and buy 2 new spools of braid. Great. So that's my marker reel all fully respooled, ready for the season. So let's find a line capacity calculator. So the one I normally use is Pattaya Fishing. There are other ones available that you can investigate if you fancy. So we just click on this one. And this basic one works on 1 line diameter. The first thing it's going to ask me for is the line diameter in millimeters. On the side of the box here, we've got the line capacity information in diameter millimeters versus capacity meters. And we've got loads of numbers from 0.28 up to 0.40. The numbers I'm going to choose for this are the 0.37 250. I'm going to choose these numbers because the bulk of this spool is going to be backed out with 0.386 mono. So it makes sense to me to choose the 0.37 250 numbers. I could choose any of the other pairs of numbers and I would get a very slightly different result. It's not going to make a massive difference, but this is the way I've decided to do it for this example. So the numbers I'm going to put in here are the 0.37 and 250. The next number it's asking for is the line diameter. I can get this off the spool of braid that I'm going to use, and in this case it's 0.18. So I'll put in 0.18 and it's going to give me an answer of 10,056 meters. So if I put 100% braid on that spool, I'd be able to fit on 1,056 meters of braid only. Now that's 3.5 times the amount of braid that I need in this instance, so I'm definitely going to have to add some backing line. Now I need to know how much backing line to put on. So the field I need to change is the 0.18 field. So I'm going to change that to 0.386 millimeters. And the number I get is 230. So if I put this line only, 100% of this line, I could fit on 230 meters onto this spool. Now for the tricky part. I only want to load on 300 meters of this onto this spool. And what I have to work out is what, in percentage terms, does 300 meters of this represent when filled onto this spool. So if we put 300 meters of this, then it represents 28.4% of this reel's total capacity. Then the rest has to be filled with backing line. So in order to load exactly 300 meters of braid onto this spool, we're going to need to put on 164 meters of backing line. Now all we have to do is measure 164 meters of backing line. Now to do this, I could set up a pair of distance sticks and count the wraps to the tune of 164 meters, or if I had enough space, I could walk out lines and pace out 164 meters. But the method I'm going to choose requires the least amount of space and the least amount of equipment. To do this method, the only thing I need to know is the line retrieve per handle turn. All I need to do is convert that into meters, and then I can work out the number of handle turns. So if I take 164 meters, divide it by 0.94, the result is 175 handle turns. So it's going to take 175 turns of the handle to load on exactly 164 meters of backing line. Now we've done all that, we can actually load the spool. The reel I'm using is designed for carp fishing, so the specifications on the box are diameter and meters. If the reel that you're using is designed for coarse fishing or sea fishing, or big game fishing, then it might state breaking strain rather than diameter. Now, breaking strain is not exactly the same as diameter. You'll get somewhere close using those numbers, following the guidelines on the breaking strain, but it's not going to be as close as working with diameter. So I'm going to work with diameter in this instance because that's the information I've got on the side of the spool box. This is the basic one that we already looked at, and there's another one, Advanced Fishing Line Capacity Estimator. There we go, this is what we need. Okay, so let's enter the data again that we need. So I'm going to use the 0.37, 250, and then the diameter of the fishing line that we're using is the 0.18. I want to load 300 meters of that. Then we're going to enter the backing line, 0.386. It gives us our answer of 164 meters of backing line, with a total number of meters of line of 300 plus 164, so 464 meters of line as the total load that we're going to put onto this spool. And this calculator confirms the maths that we did earlier. So you can do it the kind of more of a manual method if you like, but if you're just looking for a calculator that's going to work it all out for you, it's going to do it in a matter of seconds. So yeah, great tool, easy to use and really useful. The other tool I've used in the past is an app called Calcline. The only trouble with the Calcline is that it's only available for Android. The only thing that you've got to bear in mind with these calculators is that they absolutely rely on the quality of the data printed on the box. If the manufacturer's data is optimistic or pessimistic, then you're not going to get a properly filled spool, unfortunately. So sometimes if you're changing reels to a new manufacturer, you might want to use the reverse method first to see how accurate the manufacturer's data actually is.